Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. I'm Juan Olivares, if you don't know who I am. I'm president of Aquinas College, and I want to welcome all of you to our campus this morning. What a great crowd. So pleased you all came out. This is wonderful. On a beautiful day when you could be doing other things, you're here, and that's a great sign. Today's lecture by Father Robert Barron is part of our Catholic Studies speaker series, led by Dr. John Pinero, who is our director of our Catholic Studies program, and he's also professor of history. The mission of our Catholic Studies program is to share the rich experience of the Church's own culture and foster spiritual and intellectual development among our students. Today, we are happy to extend that opportunity to our greater community. I encourage everyone here and all of our community to enroll in our Catholic Studies courses and further their development of faith. Catholic Studies is just one avenue toward deepening our commitment to our Catholic faith. You may have heard the exciting news that we are planning for a new chapel here on campus, which we hope will become, yes, thank you. We are well on our way with that. The architects will be here for final discussions today. We're very excited. And we hope that that will become a centerpiece of the Catholic culture here on our campus, alongside with our academic offerings. It is our privilege today to listen to Father Barron as he discusses Thomas Merton's Metaphysics of Peace. However, I have it on good authority that Father Barron's personal hero is another Thomas, St. Thomas Aquinas. I'm also a very big fan of his. So now please, let's welcome our college chaplain, Father Stan Drongowski, who will deliver the invocation this morning. Father Stan.
Thomas Aquinas? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. God, our Father, we join the heavens and the earth in their proclamation of your power and glory. You inspire in us wonder and awe for the magnificence of your creation, and we give you thanks for the beauty and promise of this day. In your great love for us, you invite us to delve with humility and faith into the mysteries you set before us. You offer us a challenge to be a people of peace in your name, true peace driven by your love. We ask you, God of all, to send the power of your Spirit to guide our intellectual pursuits today and always. Send your Spirit of wisdom to inspire Father Barron to proclaim your word of truth. Grant us all to have open minds and hearts, so as to be filled with the light of your goodness. We ask this in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord.
Thank you, Father Stan. I'm Dr. John Pinero, and I have the privilege of introducing our speaker today. Before I do that, I would like to thank Lewis McBride and Baker Bookhouse for co-sponsoring this event. The Catholic Studies Speaker Series is funded entirely by donations and through partnerships such as this with Baker Bookhouse. I would like to thank our benefactors, therefore, especially Ken and Edie Moraski, for making it possible for Catholic Studies to continue to bring great and interesting Catholic scholars to Aquinas College. And I'd also like to welcome our newest benefactor, the Catholic Lawyers Association of Western Michigan, which seeks to promote the new evangelization and form Catholic lawyers after their patron, St. Thomas More. That's a tall order. And now the main event. Father Robert Barron is the founder of Word on Fire Ministries, the rector of Mundelein Seminary, and the creator and host of Catholicism, a groundbreaking, award-winning documentary about the Catholic faith. Clap if you've seen that. He received a master's degree in philosophy from the Catholic University of America and a doctorate in sacred theology from the Institut Catholique in Paris. He has published numerous books, essays, and articles on theology and the spiritual life. He's appeared in several media outlets, and I think you'll be is it NBC you'll be doing the commentary on for Pope Francis's visit in September. His website, wordonfire.org, has reached over 3.8 million people, which is why we hope you'll post this on your website. And his weekly YouTube videos have been viewed over 9 million times. His pioneering work in the new evangelization led the late Francis Cardinal George to describe him as, quote, one of the church's best messengers. As if this was not enough, I've discovered in the past couple of days that he also gives great golf advice. Just good golf advice would be good for me. His latest book, published by Baker Books, the co-sponsor of this event, is Catholic Theology, Essays on God, Liturgy, and Evangelization. Please welcome Father Robert Barron.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for that nice introduction. I was almost Father Thomas Aquinas. No, and as your good president said quite correctly, my great hero is Thomas Aquinas, and so I'm always happy to be speaking at a place named for St. Thomas. When I was 14 years old, I was at Fenwick High School outside of Chicago, and it was a kind of lazy spring afternoon, and one of the young Dominican friars presented to these freshmen religion class Thomas's arguments for God's existence. And I'm sure it had no impact on the other kids in the class, but for some reason, it had a huge impact on me. And it changed my life. It started me on a path I've never really left. And so I always think of Thomas Aquinas as the great patron of my life. As a priest, as a theologian, as a writer, it's that day in the spring of 1974, you can guess how old I am now, that set me on that path. And behind me on the seal, you see the wonderful words of Thomas, you know, when the Lord spoke to him from the crucifix. Thomas, you've written well of the sacrament of my body. What would you have in recompense? And I always tell my students at Mundelein, if the Lord ever asks you, what do you want? Don't say a Maserati or something. What you say is, right there, you say, non nisi te, Domine. I will have nothing except you. And so that's the guiding light of Thomas's whole life and spirituality. So I'm delighted to be at this great institution and speaking to you. Also, very grateful to Baker Books. I was there yesterday and really enjoyed the day. Baker Books represents, I think, a really great ecumenical outreach. They've been very generous to me as a Catholic author, and they have a lot of Catholic books. We had a wonderful crowd last night, so very grateful to Baker Books. Grateful, too, to Cardinal George's sister, Margaret, who's here today. Cardinal George, who died, just a few months ago, was a great mentor to me and to so many in the church. And I mean, he was the lion of the American church. He was the great intellectual spokesperson, and we miss him at so many levels. I was telling his sister that I visited his grave just a few weeks ago, and it's in a public, or it's a Catholic cemetery in Chicago, but in a very simple grave, just with a simple stone that says George, and your parents are buried there, and then Cardinal George is just there next to them. And I was very moved by it, but it was him. He wouldn't have wanted some grand monument. It's just, it spoke to the simplicity of his spirit. So, Margaret, very grateful to you for coming today and reminding all of us of the Cardinal. So good. I'll be talking today about Thomas Merton, and your president was right in suggesting that when I was a kid, these two Thomases played a big role in my life. Thomas Aquinas, as I told you, but I'll tell you how I met Thomas Merton. I was working at a bookstore called Crocs and Brentano's. They're long gone now, as most bookstores are. That's why seeing Baker was so good yesterday, seeing this beautiful bookstore. But I was working there as a 16-year-old kid, and the custom was if a paperback got a little too worn, the owner would take the cover off, and then we could take the book home if we wanted. So a copy of Merton's Seven-Story Mountain, his great spiritual autobiography, was worn out, and they tore the cover off, and my brother had it. He was working there as well, my 17-year-old brother. And he threw it to me. I was in the stock room. He threw it to me, and I caught it, and he said, "You'd like this. It's by a Trappist monk." And I said, in my 16-year-old wisdom, "I don't want to read a book by some Buddhist." He said, and I quote, "Trappists are Catholics, you idiot." And with that, I got The Seven-Story Mountain. So, and you know, those who've read that book know it's a great story of a person falling in love with God. I mean, so I think in my teenage romanticism and enthusiasm, I got caught up in that story. And so Thomas Merton, along with Thomas Aquinas, had a big impact on me as a young man. So that's why I have been studying him and writing about him for many years. I am going to plow through this paper with you. I promise it's not that long, so we should be through it about 40 minutes or so if you're keeping score. So I will be reading through the paper. With a little fortification first. So, the title is Thomas Merton's Metaphysics of Peace. I've never been comfortable with interpretations proposed either gleefully from the left or regretfully from the right, which claim that a huge gap yawns between the early Thomas Merton, of, say, The Seven-Story Mountain, and the older Merton of, say, Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. There is, to be sure, a rather remarkable development from one to the other, but as John Henry Newman taught us, authentic development is always marked by a continuity of principles and stability of form. It'll be my contention in this talk that the young Merton's conversion to Catholicism, described so vividly in his autobiography and attendant writings in the 40s and 50s, involved an immersion into an entire worldview, a significant dimension of which is a metaphysics of peace, and that this conviction found full expression in his later writings on war and nonviolence. Obviously, the explicitation of this implicit belief came only after long years of prayer, study, conversation, and the discipline of the monastic life. But there is, I will argue, no reason to suppose that Merton's commitment to nonviolence in the 1960s involved the slightest betrayal of the worldview that he adopted in the 1930s. Just the contrary. I'll try to show that the latter is, in fact, nothing but a practical consequence of the former rightly understood. So, first section now, Merton and Aquinas. In a particularly vivid section of The Seven-Story Mountain, Merton speaks of his discovery of Etienne Gilson's classic book, The Spirit of Medieval Philosophy, at Scribner's bookstore on Fifth Avenue, and how that book revolutionized his life. If you go to New York, that bookstore is long gone, but still on the side of the building that once housed it, you see Scribner's. So you can find the exact site where Merton found this book. He bought the text because he was enrolled in a course in medieval French literature and had, quote, 5 or 10 loose dollars burning a hole in my pocket. But he was mortified when he noticed the nihil obstat and the imprimatur on the frontispiece. So disgusted was he by this association with Catholic dogma that he was sorely tempted to hurl the book out of the window of the train. But, quote, by a real grace, he didn't throw it away. In fact, he actually read it. The big concept, that's Merton's phrase, that he took from Gilson's study was, quote, contained in one of those dry, outlandish technical compounds that the scholastic philosophers were so prone to use, the word aseitas. This term designates the fact that God exists through himself or by himself, ase. That he is, in Aquinas' language, ipsum esse subsistens, the sheer act of to be itself. This pithy but profound description convinced him that what Catholics mean by God is not, quote, some vague and rather superstitious hangover from an unscientific age, but rather something, I'm quoting again, deep, simple, and accurate. A child of his skeptical age, Merton had assumed that the God in whom Christians believe is nothing but a projection of their desires and subjective ideals, a Feuerbachian fantasy or Freudian wish fulfillment. There's a very interesting parallel, I think, between Merton's awakening and one described in Evelyn Waugh's masterpiece, Brideshead Revisited. That novel's narrator, Charles Ryder, from his post-conversion perspective, remembers that during his own period as a convinced agnostic, it had never occurred to him that religious dogma could ever constitute a serious worldview or be anything but a consequence of complexes. So Merton was like Charles Ryder in Brideshead. What are the implications of this revolutionary idea that so galvanized the young Thomas Merton? First is this, that God is not a being, not one existent among many, not a thing above or alongside the world. Rather, ipsum esse, right, to be itself, while remaining radically other than any finite existent, is the ground of finite existence, and therefore must be, as Aquinas put it, quote, in all things, by essence, presence, and power. And Thomas adds intime, by the way, most intimately. Augustine expressed the paradox in his elegant formulation, God is simultaneously superior sumo meo et intimior intimo meo, both higher than my highest thought and closer to me than I am to myself. But this divine intimacy entails, furthermore, the connectedness of all created realities through God. The deepest center of any one creature's existence coincides with the deepest center of any other creature's, since that center is none other than the divine power of ipsum esse. As fellow participants in God's act of to be, all things are related to one another in the most intimate way possible, for all are ontological siblings, if I can put it that way. Thus, when he wrote of brother sun and sister moon, Francis of Assisi was employing not simply evocative poetry, but accurate Christian metaphysics. The sun and moon are brother and sister to us. We're ontological siblings. When Meister Eckhart, who sat in the Dominican chair of theology in Paris just a generation after Aquinas, spoke of a shared sinking into God, he too was but drawing out the implications of this radical metaphysics of divine to be. The connectedness of all creatures to each other through God is expressed not only in formal philosophical language, but also in Christian art, architecture, and poetry. The medieval rose windows, which I came to love when I was studying over in France, those great wheels of light and color that decorate the Gothic cathedrals, symbolically bespeak participation metaphysics. At the center of the rose is invariably a depiction of Christ, and then arranged around that still point in harmonious patterns are the various médaillons, the French call them medallions, portraying saints, patriarchs, angels, etc. This signals the ordered cosmos, grounded in and related to the divine core. When the young Merton, and this is in the Seven-Storey Mountain, explored the town of Saint-Antonin in southern France, he found this metaphysics reflected in the architecture and layout of the place. All the roads and alleyways conduced to the church, reigning splendidly in the center of the town. And it was therefore impossible, he found, to move around the city without being drawn eventually to the liturgy, to the Eucharist, to the sacred. The town itself was like a rose window, like a sacred wheel. We hear an overtone of this when later in the Seven-Storey Mountain, Merton speaks of the monastery of Gethsemane as, quote, the real capital of the country in which we are living, the center of vitality that is America, the cause and reason that the nation is holding together. He saw Gethsemane as the center of a kind of rose window. At the conclusion of the Divine Comedy, a work that Merton specially reverenced, of course, takes the title Seven-Storey Mountain from the Purgatorio, Dante sees the heavenly Empyrean as a white rose, an ordered harmony gathered around a luminous center, and he envisions the saints and angels as bees carrying grace from that flower to the far corners of creation. Obviously, Dante, the architects of the Gothic cathedrals, and the town planners of Saint-Antonin knew full well that the world is a dangerous and violent place, but they also knew through their Christian convictions that the deepest reality of things is peace, and this they expressed through their art, the peaceful interconnection of all things through God. The notion of the divine aseitas has implications as well for the way we understand the very act of creation. If God is ipsum esse subsistens, then whatever else comes to existence must be created ex nihilo, literally from nothing. There can be nothing outside of the sheerly subsistent God from which or on which he works, no pre-existing matter or substrate with which he creates. Though God is like an artist in his creative imagination and intelligence, he is not like a sculptor who works with marble or a painter who assembles a picture from canvas and oil. But this implies that the act of creation is thoroughly non-invasive and non-manipulative. God's creative act is one of utter generosity, since he needs nothing outside of himself. And it's utterly nonviolent, since he shapes or influences nothing outside of himself. And this in turn signals the radical disjunction between the Christian account of the world's beginnings and most philosophical or mythological versions of the same. In many of the primal myths, creation takes place through some sort of violence, either the conquest of one god by another, or the successful battle against chaos or recalcitrant matter. Even in the philosophical doctrines of Plato and Aristotle, we find that matter, coexisting with the divine from the beginning, is shaped and molded into order. The implication of the Christian doctrine of creatio ex nihilo is that nonviolence is the deepest truth of things, non-competitiveness the ground of being. And thus, to live non-violently is not simply to be ethically upright. It is to be, if I can put it this way, cosmically correct. It is to be in line with the grain of creation. What the young Thomas Merton took in when he absorbed the medieval philosophy of Aquinas, mediated to him by Etienne Gilson, he was taking in a view of the real as a realm of coherence, participation, and nonviolence. At the truest and most metaphysically dense level, the universe he saw is a reflection of the peaceful and sheerly generous act by which ipsum esse brings it into being. Okay, second part of the talk now is on the dissolution of this vision. What I've been laying out now with the help of Gilson and Aquinas and Merton fell apart, and we, in many ways, are the unhappy heirs of that dissolution. One of the great ironies, I think, of the Seven-Story Mountain is that Merton discovered this brilliant medieval Christian vision at a moment when his literary and philosophical culture had largely forgotten or repudiated it. The tired modernity of Merton's youth, expressed aesthetically in some of his favorite writers such as D.H. Lawrence and Ernest Hemingway, and politically in the communism with which he flirted, was the consequence of the collapse of a participation metaphysics. One of the first causes of this collapse was, oddly enough, a Franciscan friar, namely John Duns Scotus. When Scotus insisted that there's a univocal concept of being, he situated God and creation under the same great ontological canopy, effectively setting God alongside the world, one being, however great, among many. But the juxtaposing of God and creatures amounts to a negation of the participation metaphysics that Aquinas advocated. On the Scotist reading, the world is comparable to God, but it doesn't share in the very to-be of God. And when this participation is denied, the essential connectedness of all creatures to one another is also undone. Scotus's univocal conception of being was carried further and deepened by William of Ockham and the nominalists inspired by him, and they in turn had a decisive influence on Martin Luther and the other reformers. The Scotist-Ockhamist strain can be discerned in Luther's embrace of a radical Theologia Crucis and his effective distanciation of God from the world. Though these theological and metaphysical moves were born of Luther's legitimate concern to guard God's transcendence and sovereignty, they would have been inconceivable within the framework of Aquinas' participation theory. What commenced as an aberrant strain within Christianity, I would argue, reached its full flowering in the philosophy of secular modernity. In the rise of Thomas Hobbes, for instance, massively influential on our view of politics, we see that once God has been effectively removed from the scene, the world becomes a place of disconnected atoms in motion. Read the beginning of Hobbes' political philosophy. It's a metaphysics he lays out. That what is finally real, he said, are just atoms, matter in motion. This view informs Hobbes' cosmology as well as his famous take on the pre-political state of nature as a realm where life is, in his famous quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In a complete reversal of Aquinas' nonviolent social ontology, here we see that the natural condition of things is individualistic and antagonistic, the war of all against all. Political cohesiveness is not, for Hobbes, a reflection of nature, just the contrary. It's an artificial construct based upon the fundamentally selfish agreement of the social contract. Though they express it a bit more delicately, both Locke and Rousseau share the Hobbesian assumption of a fundamentally violent social ontology. And that assumption shapes their view of the purpose of government as the protection of individual rights rather than the fostering of a community of justice. Now, that's a whole other semester course we could talk about. The way we've construed politics, I think, is largely based on a modern metaphysics rather than the one I've been describing in Aquinas. This tradition, furthermore, is clearly reflected in the language of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, which has wonderful elements in it. Please don't get me wrong. I think that there's a wonderful way to recover the natural law precisely within Jefferson. But when he says, governments come to be primarily in order to preserve and protect individuals from one another, to preserve our rights over and against each other. And among the fundamental rights of human beings is the freedom to pursue happiness left undefined precisely as they see fit. In all of this, we see, I would say, the political consequences of the unraveling of the medieval Catholic vision of participation. Whereas in the medieval view, violence and antagonism were seen as sinful aberrations, departures from the natural order of things. On the modern reading, they are reflections of the way the universe simply is. Now, the awakening that Thomas Merton experienced through his exposure to a medieval Catholic metaphysics triggered a process that led him eventually in 1941 to enter religious life as a Cistercian of the strict observance, as a Trappist. Immersing himself in the rhythms and routines of Trappist life, Merton was able throughout the 40s and 50s to explore the implications of his faith. And this exploration gave rise not only to his great autobiography, but also to the monastic journal, The Sign of Jonas, that great study of prayer, Seeds of Contemplation, then its successor volume, New Seeds of Contemplation, and many other texts on spirituality and theology. But, as I suggested at the outset of this talk, a major transition seemed to occur in the early 60s as Merton shifted to a concentrated focus on issues of war and peace and the praxis of nonviolent resistance. To some degree, the change was prompted by the tenor of the times, the intensification of the Cold War, the beginning of American involvement in Vietnam, etc. But it was also the unfolding of the creation participation theology that he had learned from Etienne Gilson. Before turning to the explicit text on war and peace, I want to explore what amounts to a bridge between the earlier and later phases of Merton's development, namely the moving and popular account of an experience he had at the corner of 4th and Walnut Streets in Louisville. It's now become sort of a modern classic of a mystical experience. In interpreting this well-loved passage from the Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, we are enormously helped by the recent publication, last 10, 15 years, of the complete journals of Merton, well worth plowing through. On February 28, 1958, that means just 3 weeks before the experience at 4th and Walnut, Merton reported in his journal a dream that he had, and I'm quoting now. On the porch at Douglaston, that was the home that his grandparents had on Long Island when he was a kid. This is a dream he's had. On the porch at Douglaston, I am embraced with determined and virginal passion by a young Jewish girl. She clings to me and will not let go. I see she's a nice kid in a plain, sincere sort of way. I reflect she belongs to the same race as St. Anne. I ask her name, and she says her name is Proverb. I tell her it's a beautiful and significant name, but she does not appear to like it. Perhaps others have mocked her for it. That's Merton's account in his journal of this dream he had. On March the 4th, just a few days later, Merton inscribes in his journal a sort of love letter to this dream figure, expressing his gratitude to her for awakening in him something he had lost and praising her for her, quote, virginal solitude and for the beauty of her name. Now, this character proverb has been interpreted by Merton scholars as his feminine side, as his anima in the Jungian sense, as a memory of his childhood, and all those readings probably have some validity. But see, I think the key to understanding her is the name that Merton finds so powerful and so moving. One of the most important presentations of creation in the Old Testament is found in the 8th chapter of the book of Proverbs, where the wisdom of Yahweh is personified as a girlish figure, a young girl, who plays at the feet of the Creator as he brings forth the world. I'm quoting now from the scripture. The Lord created me. This is the divine wisdom speaking. At the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he assigned to the sea its limit. When he marked out the foundations of the earth. Then I was beside him like a master worker, rejoicing before him always, delighting in the human race. That's Proverbs 8:22-31. Given the playful, associative, and fecund quality of Merton's mind, is it possible to say that what embraces Merton in his dream, this young girl called Proverb, is a reawakened sense of the purity and innocence of God's creative act? What gives weight to this interpretation is the proximity of the Proverb dream and the experience at Fourth and Walnut. I'll follow the evocative account he gives of this powerful spiritual event in the Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. While in town for a medical appointment, Merton found himself standing at a street corner in a busy section of Louisville's shopping district. You go there now, there's a nice plaque that commemorates the experience. Crowds of people hurrying by him. He comments, quote, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I theirs, and we could not be alien to one another even though we were total strangers. A dream of separateness that he had cultivated during his monastic years was suddenly over. I'm quoting again, we monks belong to God, yet so does everybody else belong to God. What dissolved for Merton during this encounter is the common modern view that the universe is composed of isolated and mutually antagonistic atoms, divorced from each other because of their common divorce from God. As Merton develops the insight, his language becomes more metaphysically exact. I'm quoting again. Then it was as if I suddenly saw the secret beauty of their hearts, the depth of their hearts, where neither sin nor desire nor self-knowledge can reach, the core of their reality. If only they could all see themselves as they really are. You see the metaphysical, ontological language he's using, which undergirds this sense of connectedness. He could love all these perfect strangers precisely because they were, at the core of their being, his own ontological siblings. Only a metaphysics of creation and participation could ground this mystical experience of union. In one of his texts on prayer, Merton described contemplation as, I love this, finding that place in you where you are here and now being created by God. Discovering, in a word, the core of your being and thus the point of contact with everything else in the universe. In his description of Fourth and Walnut, Merton gives this center a new name. I'm quoting again from him. Again, that expression, le point vierge, is French for the virginal point. Remember, he was embraced by this young girl Proverb in the dream with a virginal passion, he says. Again, that expression, le point vierge, comes in here. At the center of our being is a point of nothingness, which is untouched by sin and by illusion, a point of pure truth, a point or spark which belongs entirely to God. This little point of nothingness is the pure glory of God in us. The deepest ground of the soul, le point vierge, this virginal point, is best described as nothingness precisely because creation takes place, as we saw, ex nihilo. There's nothing that stands between us and God. It in turn implies that the most elementary truth about ourselves and the rest of creation is peace, connection, nonviolence. If we realize this truth, we could live with the grain of the cosmos, and the only practical conclusion would be a life of peace. Quoting again from Merton, "It's like a pure diamond blazing with the invisible light of heaven. It is in everybody, and if we could see it, we would see these billion points of light coming together in the face and blaze of a sun that would make all the darkness and cruelty of life vanish completely." See, this is what happened to him at Fourth and Walnut. This, I would say, awakening to the full implications of a creation metaphysics. One of the qualities of proverb in his dream that Merton found so attractive was her, quote, virginal purity. And we can see it in this account of the point vierge, the place in all things of unsullied and undisturbed contact with God. Were we to live out of that space and be illumined by that light, sin would almost automatically wither away. From a correct understanding of creation and God, orthodoxy, would come nonviolence and compassion, orthopraxis. That's what he got. Okay, now with that, I want to turn to Merton's explicit writings on peace and nonviolence. Thomas Merton's writings on nonviolence are among the most passionate and controversial in his oeuvre. It's impossible to read, say, a chant to be used around a site with furnaces, or the original child bomb, or a devout meditation in memory of Adolf Eichmann. These are all prayerful meditations Merton wrote in the 60s, without being stirred to either anger or righteous indignation, or perhaps both at the same time. As every biographer has reminded us, and becomes eminently clear in the journals, Merton had a difficult time getting many of these writings past the censors in his own order. And those that did find their way into print were met with either bewilderment or outright opposition on the part of those who wondered what had become of the pious and socially conservative convert of the Seven-Story Mountain. For though he consistently denied that he was a pacifist, and that's true throughout his writing, Merton said he's not a pacifist. In these texts from the 60s, he clearly departed from the straight-laced just war theorizing of the Cold War-era Catholic Church, and he did indeed venture into more radical territory. Moreover, he associated during this period, either directly or by correspondence, with some of the better-known peace activists of the time, including Dorothy Day, Daniel Berrigan, and James Forrest. It's my conviction that Merton did not so much depart from a conservative metaphysics and embrace a radical social theory, as he uncovered the behavioral implications of what had always been a radical metaphysics. I think from our modern point of view, that medieval participation metaphysics has always been a radical view. He pulled out some of the behavioral implications of it, I think, in the 60s. The most thorough and sustained presentation of Merton's views on the praxis of nonviolence can be found in an article entitled "The Christian and World Crisis," published in the June of 1964, just 1 year after the appearance of John XXIII's peace encyclical Pacem in Terris. What Merton tries to argue in this essay is that nonviolence is a practice deeply rooted in the truth of things, and not the quirky conviction of a few fanatics, quote, maladjusted creatures lost in impractical ideals, sentimentally hoping that prayer and demonstrations can convert men to the ways of peace. That's Merton's characterization of the cliche. At the center of his analysis is a survey of the Christian views on war and peace in the patristic era, beginning with Origen of Alexandria. Expressing a fairly common view in the ancient world, Celsus, Origen's feisty and stubborn interlocutor, had maintained that Christians, with their commitment to nonviolence, could not possibly be loyal citizens of the Roman Empire. It's a good argument, by the way, that Celsus makes. He's a Roman, aristocrat, and says, you Christians, you can't be faithful, loyal Romans because you won't fight. It's a bit like people back in the 1920s saying, well, how can you Catholics be loyal Americans? Or Englishmen in the 16th century saying, how could you Catholics be loyal to the Queen? I mean, it's a similar argument. So this is 3rd century we're talking about. Origen responds by admitting rather blandly that Christians could not support the emperor through arms, though they could certainly support his legitimate purposes through prayer. What strikes the contemporary reader, I think immediately, is the matter-of-fact quality of this rejoinder. Namely, of course, disciples of Jesus don't take up arms. And second, the frank acknowledgement of the power of prayer in the context of political life. Even though we pray all the time for our political leaders, do we really believe that this has a huge impact on what they do? But the heart of Origen's response to Celsus is not practical but theological. What Christians challenge most vociferously, he says, is the Roman assumption, shared by political powers up and down the centuries, that wars are necessary, given the basically antagonistic quality of human relationships. In light of the incarnation of the divine Logos, Christians maintain a hope that the original unity of creation can and will be restored, and they therefore have the courage to live in nonviolence and forgiveness. Origen argues, I'm quoting, "No longer do we take the sword against other nations, nor do we learn war anymore, since we become sons of peace through Jesus, who is our author, instead of following the traditional customs by which we were strangers to the covenant." An extraordinary quote, again from the 3rd century. In brief, the arrival of God's creative power, the Logos, in the midst of human history has effected a radical shift at both the ontological and epistemological levels. Now the world is in fact being restored to its original interconnectedness, and now we can begin to see the deepest truth of things, our eyes undimmed by sin. The violent and antagonistic universe, assumed by both ancient Rome and I would say modern Europe and so on, is revealed to be, in light of the coming of Christ, a sort of lie or illusion. Merton summarizes Origen's position as follows, I'm quoting, "The presence in the world of the risen Savior, in and through his church, has destroyed the seeming validity of all that was in reality arbitrary, tyrannical, or absurd in the fictions of social life. Therefore, Christians should live stubbornly in the truth, incarnating the end times even now, in the hopes that they will thereby dispel the clouds of illusion that surround them." After Origen, Merton turns his attention to another Christian theologian who, 200 years after Origen's Contra Celsum, wrestled on the grandest possible scale with questions of war and peace. I'm talking, of course, about St. Augustine. In The City of God, Augustine of Hippo offered a theology of history, at the heart of which is an articulation of the relationship between two fundamentally divergent conceptions of the human community, one deceitful and the other truthful. Augustine's civitas terrena, he calls it. The city of man, we'll say, but he calls it the earthly city usually. Augustine's civitas terrena is that collectivity which, predicated upon love of self, is inherently unstable and violent. Turned in on themselves, the members of this society cannot sustain true communio, and their being together is therefore accidental and essentially antagonistic. The driving force of the earthly city is what Augustine, I think, magnificently called the libido dominandi, which means the lust to dominate. I think it's one of the great descriptions of sin, the lust to dominate. Watch it in all forms of sin. And this quality is no more fully displayed, Augustine thought, than in the paragon of earthly justice, namely the Roman Empire. Rome has indeed established a kind of stability, the Pax Romana so-called. But, says Augustine, it's a phony and dangerous peace because it's predicated finally upon the ruthless threat and exercise of violence. Furthermore, the dysfunction of the Roman polity is a reflection and function of the false theology of the empire. The gods and goddesses of Rome, whom Augustine consistently characterizes as demons, I think quite rightly, are themselves venal, vain, self-absorbed, and violent. It's a very interesting thing. We become like what we worship. It's a basic biblical principle. Right? You become what you worship. Whom did the Romans worship? Well, read the stories of the gods and goddesses, full of vanity and violence and arrogance and so on. Whom do we worship? See, and for Augustine, that makes all the difference, whom we worship. What the Bishop of Hippo proposes as a counterforce is the civitas Dei, the city of God, that community grounded in love of the true God. Given to the Creator, rooted in their common center, the members of this collectivity can find true communion in and through each other. In this context, antagonism is recognized as the lie, a distortion of the truth of things, and thus compassion, forgiveness, and nonviolence can readily surface and flourish. Here's the point I was making. Just as the civitas terrena flows from false worship, so the civitas Dei is a consequence of right praise. You know that word orthodoxy, the fundamental sense of that is not right belief, but right praise. Doxa means glory, praise. So the right praise of the church leads to the right ordering of the city. The true God, Augustine knows, is not a self-obsessed potentate, but rather himself a communio of persons, ordered hierarchically but non-competitively, and in the measure that they honor this God, the members of the Civitas Dei become his peaceful icon and reflection. Merton finds compelling Augustine's insight that in the mythology of Rome, the great city was founded in the wake of the murder of Remus by his brother Romulus. That's why it's Rome and not Rheme, right? And Romulus killed Remus. And that this is precisely echoed in the biblical account of the fratricidal Cain as the founder of cities. Augustine saw that, wonderful insight. The great city of Rome, founded through an act of violence. The founder of cities in the Bible is a killer of his brother. Whether the fact is viewed positively or negatively, violence conditions the civitas terrena from the beginning. And on Augustine's reading, the great representatives of the peaceful civitas Dei, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Jeremiah, Jesus himself, are necessarily pilgrims and wanderers, resident aliens in and among the earthly cities. The peaceful order of the Trinitarian community and the peaceful order of creation are the deeply countercultural truths preached by and embodied in the peacefulness of the Civitas Dei. Now, what might be surprising is you think Augustine, he's the great theoretician of just war. That's how we know him. But see, this is the fundamental stuff in Augustine. See, and to be sure, Augustine departs from Origen's total commitment to nonviolence. He allows for some limited use of coercive punishment and warfare. But this is, as he repeatedly insisted, nothing but a concession to sin. I mean, to read Augustine as some kind of warmongering, justifier of war, that's completely alien to his spirit. He saw that as a painful concession to sin. The tragic acknowledgement that sometimes goods have to be protected through the use of force, but it's certainly not the acceptance of the false theology and metaphysics of the earthly city. It seems to me this Augustinian resolution is quite close to Merton's own, a fundamental, clear, theologically informed acceptance of the way of peace without an absolutist embrace of pacifism. I think Merton takes a fundamentally Augustinian position. After this consideration of the patristic period, Merton casts a glance at modern political thought, as exemplified by Hobbes, as we saw, and Machiavelli, and notes their effective unraveling of the Christian vision. Then he turns his attention to an analysis of Pope John's recent at that time, Pacem in Terris, a text he interprets as a ringing reaffirmation of the integral Christian metaphysics of peace. Though the encyclical treats of individual rights, the need for an international authority, the tensions of the Cold War, etc., its primary focus and organizing principle is the order of God's creation. Whatever we say about the rapport between peoples and nations, Pope John says, must be predicated upon the undergirding truth of the world. Merton says that Pope John's fundamental optimism about the social life flows from Paul's cosmic optimism, as expressed in the letter to the Colossians. I'm quoting, "All things have been created through and for him. He is before all else that is. In him all things hold together." There's first chapter of Colossians. That's the ground for Thomas Aquinas. Thomas gives that precise metaphysical expression. Etienne Gilson mediated Aquinas to Thomas Merton, who's now writing these words. That's the tradition it's coming from, ultimately, is the New Testament. Because the world's been made and redeemed through the divine Logos, things and people, despite all relatively superficial obstacles, hold together at the center. Isn't that what Paul's saying in Colossians? The Christian call for peace is therefore not a whistling in the dark, but an evocation of the deepest grain of the universe. Merton explicitly links this Pauline vision to the Thomistic metaphysics that so galvanized him as a young man. I'm quoting Merton now. St. Thomas dared to demonstrate the natural goodness of the world as something that could not be fully understood and vindicated except in the light of the doctrine of creation. This is Merton 1964, but echoing what he learned in the 1930s from Gilson. And then he makes the connection between this intuition and the Pope's argument for peace. I'm quoting. As Pieper said, he means Joseph Pieper there. As Joseph Pieper said of St. Thomas, so we can say of Pope John, to his mind it would be utterly ridiculous for man to undertake to defend the creation. Creation needs no justification. The order of creation is, on the contrary, precisely the standard which must govern every man's judgment of things and of himself. There's your metaphysics of peace. But what is this order? Whether it's expressed by Paul, Origen, Augustine, or Thomas, but the order of participation, connection, nonviolence, and love. Having invoked so many of the greatest theological thinkers of the tradition, Merton draws his meditations to a close, not with a theologian, but with a saint and poet. Toward the end of his life, St. Francis sent one of his friars to Assisi in order to mediate a dispute between the mayor and the bishop of the town. He told them to sing in their presence the Canticle of the Sun, Francis' praise of God and his creatures. For he was convinced that the best way to turn people's minds to peace, quote, was to remind them of the goodness of life and of the world. After the friar sang his hymn, the mayor broke into tears, and the bishop confessed his own haughtiness, and there was peace between them. As I contended earlier in this paper, brother, sun, and sister moon can be coherently uttered only by someone who's understood an ontology of participation and connection, a metaphysics of peace. Just a quick word of conclusion. It's been my central argument in the paper that the proclamation of creation is the condition for the possibility of real peace. For creation implies both nonviolence and deep interconnection. I've tried to show that Thomas Merton, throughout his career, knew this in his bones. He learned it first from the participation ontology of Aquinas that seeped into his own mind through Gilson. It was renewed in the virginal embrace of proverb, the dream figure, and in the Point Vierge mysticism of Fourth and Walnut. And it surfaced again in the creation-based summons to peace in his 1960s writings on nonviolence. I'm persuaded as well that Merton's meditations on this rapport might indicate a way forward for Catholic and Christian social teaching. Believers in creatio ex nihilo have no need to import a social theory from secular or pagan sources, either from Aristotle, Cicero, Adam Smith, or Karl Marx. For a participation metaphysics is itself a distinctive and compelling social theory, one of forgiveness and nonviolence. God bless you all. Thanks for listening. Thanks. God bless you all. Thank you for that. I think we have a little time for Q&A. There's some, please.
Yep, we got about 20 minutes. We have wired microphones on both sides of the room if you'd like to step up here. Otherwise, I have a wireless microphone. If you'd like to raise your hand, I can bring it around.
Please.
Thank you for your superb paper. I really appreciate the fact that you said cosmology precedes ethical theory,
Yeah.
and we don't have to buy into the politics of the world. I'm wondering if we haven't bought a Hobbesian social ontology, even in the church. If you follow some of the stuff on Facebook, is very disturbing recently when I see some of the stuff on Bruce Jenner, et cetera, et cetera. And we've forgotten this connectedness and the spirituality of nonviolence. What do you suggest we should do about a spirituality of nonviolence within the church itself? I mean, I'm not so much concerned about the state. I expect the state to operate on different terms, not the ideal as it should be, but what do you do about a nonviolence and corrective for those of us within the community called church? What
Yeah.
do you suggest?
No, thanks for the observation and the question, because I really agree with your observation that metaphysics has to come first, and you can't do ethics properly without a metaphysical grounding. And I think our great theoreticians have always known that. We take in with our mother's milk a false ontology in many ways. We take in the false ontology of antagonism, and that affects the way we think about the world ethically. So I agree with you on that. I furthermore agree that if the light goes out, we're meant to be the light of the world. If the light goes out, who's going to illumine things? We're meant to be the salt of the earth. If we lose our saltiness, who's going to resalt us, as Jesus said? So that's right. Our job in the world as a church is to remind the world of the deepest truth of things. If we simply embody what you see anywhere else in the world, then we've lost our prophetic and missionary purpose. So I agree with that. Can the church recover for itself resources of nonviolence? And I would stand very much with, as I laid it out, Augustine and Merton. I don't subscribe to an absolute pacifism. I think there are times when certain goods are so fundamental that the only way we can defend them in a fallen and conflictual world is through violence. So I'm not a pacifist. But I also think we grossly underestimate the power of nonviolence, and we've forgotten how to use it. Look in the last century. Gandhi, who learned his nonviolence not so much from his Hindu tradition, he learned it from us. When Gandhi was a young guy in London, he reads the Gospel of Matthew, and he reads the Sermon on the Mount, but he read it with fresh eyes. He'd never read it before. It took his breath away. And he went to his Christian friends and said, "This is amazing." And the Christians all said, "Well, no one takes that very seriously." But by God, Gandhi took it seriously and effected this massive social reform. Martin Luther King, of course, learned it from his own Christian text, but also through Gandhi. John Paul II, the best example in the late 20th century, of someone that used provocative nonviolence in a very powerful way and effected the most radical social change. If you told me when I was a kid in the 1970s that the Soviet Empire would fall apart with barely a shot being fired and that the Pope would be the principal protagonist, it would be like a fantasy. That's exactly what happened. But what did he use but provocative nonviolence? So to your point, I think we as a church need to recover those sources, and we need to embody that to the world, because that's our job. Our job is not just to retire into our private spirituality, but now to be salt and light for the world. So I'd say study the great practitioners of nonviolence and learn how they did it. And we need to be in the forefront of it as a church. So thank you for that. Please. I'm sorry, go ahead.
First of all,
We have competing microphones. So go ahead.
Father, thank you. First of all, I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you for coming and being with us today. So your talk was very insightful and very
Thanks.
informative.
We can't hear you too well. Do you have the mic on?
Hello?
There you go.
Okay, there we go. First of all, thank you.
Good.
I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you for coming and being with us today. I wanted to go back to the beginning of your talk when you were speaking about Thomas Merton and noticing how the churches were the centers of the towns and everything surrounded around that,
Yeah.
and how that was very metaphorical to how God is with reality. And you mentioned something about that when you talk about the Jewish temples of Jesus' time, where the temples were the place where Israel goes up to.
Yeah.
And it was curious too about. I was wondering if what Jesus' church, what he established on earth, if that was kind of the fulfillment of the temple and the concept of the temple, and in relation to the metaphysics of how that works, if that can give us some guidance in how we can go forward in today's world, kind of how the Jewish world saw the temple as a way to inform their mentality.
Yeah, good, because the temple means the place of praise, right? And as Paul Tillich said, all you need to know about someone you can discern from asking one question. What do you worship? That's a very biblical idea. We become what we worship. Worthship, right, from the Middle English means, what's of highest worth to you? Everyone's got it. Atheists have it. We all worship something, right? It might be money, it might be sex, pleasure, power, honor, my own ego, but there's something that I worship as of highest value to me. Everything else in my life will arrange itself around that point of worship. The Bible keeps saying, worship God alone. Look at Aquinas, non nisi te domine. What do you want? See, the Lord, what do you worship? What do you want? Non nisi te. I want nothing except you. See? Now that's a rightly ordered soul. That right worship will lead, the medievals knew, to a rightly ordered city. And that's why those towns, still, in a place like Chartres, you can see it. When you go into Chartres, even today, well, what dominates the skyline but the great cathedral? And then everything revolves around it, literally. Everything leads to the praise of God. Good. Go into our cities, what do you see? Churches? Like Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago, you have to get a guidebook, and where is it? Amidst all the... But what do you see, by the way? Well, you see the great towers of industry and the towers of business and of insurance. Like, the three biggest buildings in Chicago. We have the Hancock Building, the Aon Building, and now the Willis Tower. They're all insurance companies. Now, I got nothing against insurance people. Please don't get me wrong. I'm nothing against it. But isn't it interesting how you walk into this great city of Chicago? What are the biggest buildings? Insurance companies, to insure us against the dangers of the world and so on. That tells you a lot about what a society values, And so to your point about the temple or the church being at the center of a city or a town, that does tell you something about the attitude of that people. So there's where we have been very influenced by a different ontology, a different type of worship. And I think we should be fighting back a bit, that the praise of God belongs at the center of life. That's what the liturgy is all about. I think, sir, go ahead, please.
It's very pleasant to see you in person as opposed to YouTube. I get to ask you a question.
I do have 3 dimensions from time to time.
You mentioned in the dream that Merton had that he talked about the girl proverb, and you specifically referred to virginal.
Yeah.
And then when you spoke of his experience at Walnut.
Yeah, Fourth and Walnut.
Fourth and Walnut. And you spoke about how, once again, he talked about this virginal place in the heart. Do you see a connection there with John Paul II's theology of the body and his reference to the virginal state, the original state? And what would you say that might speak to us on many other fronts of concern?
No, it's good. I mean, maybe you could develop that, because I had not made that connection, but I think that's right. John Paul has got this richly metaphysical view of things, and so his theology of the body is not just an ethic. It really is grounded in a metaphysics. His anthropology is deeply philosophical. So I think that's good. I think that's the right connection. I'd have to think about it more to say something really intelligent about it, but I think that's a good line to follow, I do. Please.
Father, I'm wondering if you can flesh out more Merton's views. You said that he was not an absolute pacifist, and you said that his views were similar to Augustine's in that there could be a time for the use of violence to punish the wicked or to protect the vulnerable. And so I'm wondering, in particular, what Merton's views would be. What would he say to the Christian in the military? And like World War II, I'm curious about his thoughts as to World War II. And
he does say a couple things about World War II, and at that point I think he was supportive of it. Keep in mind, he's doing this writing on nonviolence during the Vietnam period, just as Vietnam's getting underway. And that war was famously controversial, and many felt it was unjustified. But what you said at the beginning is right and worth repeating, that Merton again and again said, I'm not an ideological pacifist. There are times when. But I think he perceived, reading the signs of his times, what was needed was a stronger voice in favor of nonviolence. I think it is very much like Augustine, who's the mainstream of Augustine's thought is very strong on this ontology of peace. But he acknowledges, given the fact of sin and the fall, sometimes grudgingly we have to. The thing too about that's interesting, the just war theory, I'm a great advocate of it, because the just war theory of the Catholic Church is not a warmongering, let's go get them. It's a really, really strict limitation of violence. I mean, I think it's very hard to find, frankly, a war that we could justify using the real strict categories of the just war theory. Even World War II. Look at the practice of World War II, the firebombing of Dresden, the firebombing of Tokyo, the atomic bombs. There's no way you could justify those on Catholic social theory grounds. So my point there is the just war theory should not be construed as, anything goes, let's go out there and, rah-rah. It's a very, very strict interpretation. Now, having said all that, what would Merton say to someone in the military? What do I say, for example? when we did the Catholicism series, one of the gestures we made was we sent a box of it to every military base around the world. I have great affection for the chaplains in the military, for the people who serve in the military. There's a legitimate moral role. But should people in the military really know the just war theory? I would say, yeah. In fact, it's funny, just last week I got an invitation to speak at West Point to all the cadets. And I was thinking, what do I say to them? And maybe that's it, is to say, I really subscribe to the just war theory, which I do. But if you really look at it, that's a very strict set of limitations. So, kind of thinking out loud in answer to your provocative question, you know. Yeah, please. Go ahead, please.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. I was curious, both in Merton's view and in your view, do you need to accept the metaphysics of peace in order to correctly apply just war theory in practice?
Yes.
So are there? Yeah. Thanks.
No. I think that's a good way to put it. I would say that's right. That if you don't have the metaphysics behind it, it'll be applied very awkwardly or artificially, or probably without the right of stringency. So I think that's a good intuition, that you should have that in place, and then you'll understand how and why to apply those criteria.
If I could briefly follow up,
please.
Is this metaphysics necessary for the correct application? So I see that it can lead to it is necessary. Okay.
Yeah, necessary maybe is such a strong word. I think it's a very important support to understand them properly.
Okay.
I'd say that, yeah.
Thank you.
Please, yeah.
You've used a lot of big words and a lot of lofty thoughts have been floating around here. I would just like you to elaborate a little bit about the role of Jesus in our lives. How it seems to me that seeking him, a lot of these things will be revealed to us and fall into place without us trying to understand and practice and track down all these things that are impossible in our own power. So it's a simple person.
Yeah.
What?
It all comes from Jesus. In other words, this whole vision comes from Jesus. Now go back to Matthew 5, 6, 7. Go back to the Sermon on the Mount. And what do you find but an ethics that's coming right up out of a deep metaphysics? So why do you love your enemy? Jesus says, so counterintuitively, love your enemy? Are you joking? Love him? Maybe tolerate him, but love him? But see, how can you say that? Unless you know that at the deepest possible level, you are connected even to your enemy. So the ISIS murderers, I think the most wicked people right now on the planet, right? The most repugnant people on the planet. Should we love them? Yes. How? Unconditionally. What does love mean? Love means willing the good of the other, right? Says Thomas Aquinas. We love them. Now, how could you possibly say that unless you believe in this metaphysics of connection? That even with them, those horrible people, wicked people, we are connected by a bond that makes us ontological siblings. My point there is Jesus' ethics in the Sermon on the Mount is predicated upon this vision of life. So it's all coming from him.
But that's Jesus' teachings. What about Jesus in us?
Yeah, well, that's it, but that's how he teaches you. As Augustine says, he's the master that's teaching you in you, not from outside. Like I'm a very inadequate teacher standing outside teaching. Christ teaches you from within. So that's quite right. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, says Paul. That's Christ living in you that's teaching you these truths, So no, I think that's right.
Well, I just want more of him, and how do we do that?
By turning your life ever more and more to him, so that you can say every aspect of me belongs to Christ, that you become a rose window. Think of all the medallions in the rose window: your mind, your will, your passion, your private life, your sexuality, your public life, your friendships, your entertainment, that all of it is connected to him, and therefore it holds together as a beautiful harmony. That's how you do it. Keep surrendering every aspect of your life to him, to him. Let him be, therefore, the cathedral at the center of your city, so that everything in you turns to him to praise. That's how you do it, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, please.
Okay, when I was listening to your explanation of Thomas Merton and his metaphysics of peace, one thing that came to mind was passivity. And I don't know that this is, it's just something that the impression I got, and in the context of the broader gospel, I don't think it can be passive.
Yeah,
because
quite right.
But the impression I got is that you have this passive unity with everybody else, And for me, that's a little bit, it's true that we all share in the being of God, and that gives us unity. But my question is, and I guess to put it specifically, we'll put it in context of Thomas Merton. That's his talk today. So does Thomas Merton have an understanding of an active living out of this unity? Because God is Trinity, so God is relationship. So where does this unity, this being of God, become a relationship that we can give to others?
That's exactly it. In other words, I don't want anything passive. I don't think there's anything passive about it. What you want is an active engagement of this deep truth. So if you want to call that, a passive connection, meaning it's already there, but now actively engage it and now live it vibrantly on the public stage. Now you've got the church in its dynamic mode. Best example, John Paul II. I have it in the Catholicism series. I learned it from George Weigel's biography. John Paul, 1979, with 1 million people around him, the communist government behind him, and just starts speaking about human rights and speaking about God and speaking about dignity. Well, what's he talking about but creation metaphysics? And then the people respond with, we want God, for 15 minutes. We want God. That's when the Soviet Empire collapsed. It collapsed that day. So there's nothing passive about that. This very vibrant figure who's invoking this tradition and then awakening in the people this very active response. That's, I think, what I'm talking about and what I think Merton is implying too. Good, I'm glad you brought that up.
Okay.
Please. Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Can you
You're
hear
welcome.
okay? Yes. The question that I have, and you touched on it just a little bit, is this whole ISIS issue. ISIS is sort of like spilled Kool-Aid everywhere. Are there any thoughts on how they can be dealt with collectively without violence? Because it seems the more violence that there is, like the bombings and all that, they kind of stir up more like a beehive. And I just thinking about it, if you meet one individually, that's one thing. But the way these seemingly really good people are being just sort of sucked into it, vulnerable people, young people, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, no, I know, and it's a horrifically complicated issue. It comes home to me because a kid, I'll call him, that I taught 20 years ago is now a bishop in the Assyrian Church of the East. They're in union with the Catholic Church, but they're based over there. And this guy that I taught out in the classroom at Mundelein is now a bishop in that region, and people are streaming to him, fleeing from ISIS. And we just got communications from him. He's in serious danger himself, and is giving shelter to these people. So I know, I know from him how dire this is. With an Augustinian framework in mind, might there be, in those cases, violence called for? I think so. I think some action's got to be taken. But then look at the great practitioners of nonviolence, how they did it, how you provocatively and actively engage wickedness by a refusal to cooperate with it. So I would urge looking to the Gandhis and Kings and John Paul II's of how you do that, but not urging an ideological pacifism. I'm with Merton and Augustine there, but I think drawing on our resources of provocative engagement of evil. The cross is the supreme example, right? The cross is the supreme example of how to engage wickedness. So the cross is not here, but no, that's not a judgment. I'm just looking to illustrate the cross. But what did Jesus do? But he took on the violence of the world and then swallowed it up within the greater divine mercy. All Christian nonviolent activists are imitating the cross, the dynamics of the cross. Now for the particulars, we have to do a lot more talking and a lot more looking at what's on the ground. But those are the principles, I think.
Thank you.
Great. God bless you all. Thanks for coming today. Thank you all.